This week, we'll be looking at two key passages from the Transcendental Analytic. The first passage, Kant titles, "On the Clue to the Discovery of All Pure Concepts of the Understanding." Later, Kant refers to this passage as the metaphysical deduction of the categories. Here, Kant attempts to identify the a priori concepts that are the forms of the understanding. The second passage we'll be looking at is called the Principles of a Transcendental Deduction. And in this passage, Kant articulates what it's going to take to prove that our a priori concepts have a justified application to the objects given to us in our experience. The way Kant sets out to identify the a priori concepts that are the forms of the understanding is first to ask, what is the basic function of the understanding? You can recall from week 3 of this course, when we studied Kant's theory of cognition, that he identifies the fundamental act of the understanding as judgment. And he says that the understanding is, at bottom, a capacity for judging, where judging involves unifying concepts in such a way that amounts to the cognition of an object. Now, Kant's idea is that the forms of the understanding will be the basic ways in which concepts must be unified in order to amount to the cognition of an object. So the thought is, not just any way of relating concepts will amount to a judgment, since not just any way of relating concepts gives us a cognition of an object. So, first off, a relation of concepts won't amount to a cognition of an object unless that relation of concepts is determined with respect to its quantity. So if I have the concepts horse and brown, and I put them together, horse is brown, I don't yet have a judgment unless I determine that my judgment is about all horses, some horses, or this particular horse. So the question here isn't what does it take for our judgments to be true, but rather what does it take for a relation of concepts to amount to a judgment at all? What does it take for a relation of concepts to be about an object, and so possibly true or false? The second basic function Kant identifies is quality. The three qualities of judgment are affirmative, negative, and infinite. So the thought here is that a judgment could have the content, all horses are brown, but either have the quality of affirmation or negation. I could either be affirming that all horses are brown in saying it is the case that all horses are brown, or I could be denying that same content. My judgment could be it's not the case that all horses are brown. Now, Kant thinks that quality is one of the basic functions for judging, since unless it's determined whether I'm affirming or denying a particular judgmental content, it's not yet determinate whether my judgment is true or false. To understand infinite quality of judgment, Kant wants us to consider the difference, for example, between judging that 4 is not prime and that horses are not prime. The thought here is that 4 is non-prime and horses are not prime in two very different senses. I can truly judge that it's not the case that horses are prime, since horses are not numbers, and so aren't candidates for being prime. When I judge that horses are not prime, I'm simply saying that horses are excluded from the range of things that are prime. But when I'm judging that 4 is not prime, I'm doing more than this. I'm saying that 4 has the determinate property of being a non-prime number. So this is the difference between a negative judgment and an infinite judgment. As for the judgmental function of relation, Kant's thought here is that in order to make a particular judgment, my judgment has to bear some determinate relation to all of my other judgments. My judgment has to either be independent of, dependent on, or interdependent with my other judgments. Right, so the thought here is that I might judge that 5 is prime, whether or not it rains. I might judge that there will be fog if the temperature reaches the dew point. Or I might judge either I'll get takeout or else I'll have to make dinner. The thought here is that I'm not in a position to make a given judgment unless I've determined what relation that judgment bears to all the other judgments I make. Or that relation might be independence, but it might also be dependence or interdependence. The final function of judging that Kant identifies is modality. So the thought here is that a particular relation of concepts doesn't amount to a judgment unless I have assigned some modality to that relation of concepts. So I might judge that all horses are necessarily brown. I could judge that all horses are actually brown, or I could judge that it's possible for all horses to be brown. But if I haven't said whether my judgmental content is being asserted or denied necessarily, actually, or possibly, then I haven't made a judgment. So this then is Kant's account of the basic functions involved in any possible judging. And from these basic forms of judging, Kant attempts to derive our a priori concepts of the understanding. The key to this derivation is Kant's claim at A79B105 that the same function that gives unity to the different representations in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of different representations in an intuition. So Kant's idea here is that if the same functions of the understanding that are responsible for uniting concepts into judgments are used in uniting instead representations into intuitions, then these concepts will be the basic categories of the understanding. So here then is Kant's list of all the a priori concepts. These concepts include unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, limitation, substance, cause, community, and possibility, existence, and necessity. Now this derivation of our 12 a priori concepts is what Kant calls his metaphysical deduction of the categories. It's meant to identify what our a priori concepts are, while the next chapter of the critique, the transcendental deduction of the categories, is meant to show that we're justified in applying these concepts to the objects given to us in appearance. It's in next week's reading where Kant provides this justification. What he does in this week's reading is he attempts to articulate what it's going to take to justify our a priori concepts. He articulates this in two ways. First, by contrasting his project with those of Locke and Hume, and second, by returning to the question in Kant's 1772 letter to Marcus Hertz that we looked at in the first week of this course. Kant describes Locke as attempting to provide an empirical deduction of our a priori concepts. Now, Kant grants that our empirical concepts can be given empirical deductions. So if I'm using the concept of blue, for example, and someone calls upon me to give an account of what right I have to apply this concept to the objects of my experience, I can meet this challenge by adducing particular experiences, that is, particular experiences of blue things. These experiences show that blue is a property that things have, so I'm justified in applying the concept of blue to various things. Now, Kant's criticism of Locke is that the categories can't be justified in this way. Take the category of cause, for example. Kant's thought is that I can see a baseball strike the window. I can see the window break, but I can't see the causal connection. So I can't point to any experiences of seeing causal connection to justify my application of the concept of cause to the objects of my possible experience in general. Recall from the Prolegomena and the introduction, Kant writes that experience teaches us what is the case, but never what must be the case and cannot be otherwise. I can see that the baseball strikes the window, and I can see that the window breaks, but I can't see that given that the baseball strikes the window must break. My experience never delivers claims with this sort of modal force. So for that reason, Locke's attempt to justify our application of categories like cause to the objects of our possible experience by adducing particular experiences is doomed to fail. Now, Kant sees Hume as recognizing this very point, and then of despairing to provide any alternative account of the justification of our a priori concepts. On Kant's reading of Hume, Hume maintains that we do apply the concept of cause in our experience, and indeed that we must apply the concept of cause in our experience, but that we have no justification for doing so. Instead, as Kant reads Hume, Hume thinks that our application of the concept of cause is a habit, something that Kant calls a subjective necessity. For Hume, I can't help but use the concept of cause in my experience, but not because I ought to use it, simply because of the way my mind has become habituated through the associations in my past experience. Now, unlike Hume, Kant intends to show that our use of the categories in our experience is justified, and unlike Locke, Kant aims to provide that justification not empirically by adducing particular experiences, but instead transcendentally, independent of any particular experiences. Kant explains how he intends to do so by recasting the question from his letter to Hertz. You'll recall that in the letter to Hertz, Kant's question is how mental representations could be about mind-independent objects. And this was a puzzle, since it was difficult to identify the causal relationship between mind-independent objects and our mental representations, in the case of our a priori concepts. In the critique, the question is no longer about the relationship between mental representations and mind-independent objects. Instead, the relation is between our representations and the objects of our representations, which are appearances. And moreover, the relationship between the representation and the object of representation is not considered to be a causal representation, but rather a representation of making possible. So in the critique, what Kant asks is how synthetic representation and its objects relate to one another. He explains that either the object makes the representation possible, or the representation makes the object possible. Much like in the letter to Hertz, Kant contends that if the object makes the representation possible, then the representation is empirical. And like in the letter to Hertz, Kant maintains that our a priori representations don't bring their objects into existence in the way that the will brings its objects into existence. In the critique, Kant formulates the solution to this problem by saying that the representation can still determine the object a priori if it's possible through the representation alone to cognize something as an object. So this is the principle of the transcendental deduction. This is what the transcendental deduction will have to show about the categories, that our a priori concepts make it possible for our experience to be the experience of objects. So the thought here is that even though our experience is not of things in themselves, there's still a distinction between the way things given to us in our experience seem to be and the way that things given to us in our experience are. And so what Kant aims to show in the transcendental deduction is that it's in virtue of the categories that our experience is more than a representation of the way things seem, and instead amounts to a representation of the way that appearances are. Another way of thinking about this is that it's due to objects affecting us that we have sensations, and it's due to the forms of our sensibility that sensations are arrayed in space and time. But the question is, what makes a spatio-temporal array of sensations the representation of an object? And what Kant wants to show is that it's in virtue of the categories. that objective representations are possible. What Kant aims to show is that the categories are conditions of the possibility of objective experience, or conditions of the possibility of our experience being of objects. Now, in understanding what this means, we have to carefully distinguish Kant's position from Hume's. Kant and Hume agree that it's necessary for us to employ the categories in our experience. The question that divides Kant and Hume is why? Why must we use the categories in our experience? Hume's view is that it's merely subjectively necessary. We have to use the categories in our experience because of the way our minds have been constituted through habit. What Kant wants to prove against Hume is that our use of the categories in our experience is objectively necessary. He wants to show that it's necessary for us to use the categories in our experience, not just because of the nature of the mind, but because of the nature of appearances. Kant was not aiming to show that it's in the nature of things in themselves to fall into the categories. Kant thinks that much can't be shown. By the same token, Kant thinks he can show more than just that we can't help but use the categories in our experience because of the way our minds are constituted. Kant thinks there's a middle ground here. Without showing that things in themselves must be categorical, Kant aims to show that appearances must be categorical, and not just because we have to apply the categories to them because of the way our minds are, but rather because it's in the nature of an appearance to fall under the categories. The thought here is that an appearance wouldn't be an appearance of an object if it weren't for the a priori concepts of understanding. Okay, so as I said, the argument that the categories are in fact objective conditions of the possibility of experience is going to be in the reading for next week. What's important for this week is to understand what Kant thinks it'll take to show that the categories are justified in application to the objects of our possible experience. Okay, so Kant's account of what it'll take to justify the categories is one thing that you might focus on in your papers for this week. Two other potential topics of your paper this week are the unavoidable necessity of the transcendental deduction and the inevitable difficulty of the transcendental deduction. So at A87, B119, Kant explains that the transcendental deduction is unavoidably necessary because of a problem that arises with regard to our concept of space. Problem, Kant seems to say, is that with the pure concepts of the understanding, the concept of space becomes ambiguous. One thing to think about is why the concept of space becomes ambiguous and how the transcendental deduction is meant to solve this ambiguity. As for the inevitable difficulty of the transcendental deduction, Kant attempts to draw a contrast between his account of how space and time relate to appearances, and his account of how the categories relate to appearances. He says that in the case of the concepts of space and time, we were able to make comprehensible with little effort how these necessarily relate to objects. He says that with the categories of the understanding, however, a difficulty is revealed. What Kant seems to say is that the case of space and time was easy because an object can appear to us only by means of the pure form of sensibility, while by contrast, what makes the deduction of the categories difficult is that objects can indeed appear to us without necessarily having to be related to these functions of the understanding. The question here is how do we understand this difficulty of the transcendental deduction without making the transcendental deduction impossible? It would seem that Kant's aim in the transcendental deduction is to show that the categories make it possible for our experience to present us with objects. Yet Kant seems to be saying that the deduction will be difficult because the categories are not necessary conditions for the experience of objects. Kant writes that appearances could after all be so constituted that the understanding would not find them in accord with the conditions of its unity. So something to think about in your paper is what Kant is trying to say in this passage at A89B122. What contrast between space and time and the categories does Kant have in mind? And how does this contrast not undermine the project that he's attempting in his transcendental deduction?